So like,
I think that's us. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that UBC Okanagan is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many different places, some near and some far, and I encourage you to recognize the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. I'm Jen Jacoby, and I am the very, very new director of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention. I've been a member for many, many years since the Institute started. So I'm very honored to be in this position now. And I'm grateful for the mentorship and friendship of Dr. Joan Batorf throughout my career here at UBCO. She's irreplaceable. And I just want to say thank you, Joan. It is my pleasure to be here today. And it's largely from the mentorship I received from you. So thank you. You have built an iconic institute here at UBCO, and I intend to build on your legacy. So fingers crossed as we move forward. And with that, today there's a few housekeeping items before I introduce the amazing speaker that we have today. First off, closed captioning. There's a closed captioning box that can be moved to your preferred place on your screen by just clicking on it and dragging it where you would like it. If you don't like it anywhere on your screen, you can close the captioning and turn it off by just selecting, as weirdly as this sounds, the hide caption button will turn off the closed captioning. If you have questions, I'm going to encourage individuals to type them in the chat box, and questions will be read at the end of the presentation for Dr. Gainforth. So today's event that's brought to you by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention at UBC Okanagan is entitled Combating Tokenism in Research, Advancing the Science and Practice of Meaningful Engagement. And it is my pleasure to have today and introduce our amazing speaker, Dr. Heather Gainforth. Dr. Gainforth is an associate professor in the School of Health and Exercise Sciences, a very great colleague here. She's in the Faculty of Health and Social Development at UBC Okanagan, and I believe she's also a research chair for the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research. So with that, Heather, I'm going to turn this over to you and turn my camera off.
awesome. Thank you, Jen. And thank you to all of you for coming and joining today. I have to echo Jen's comments about Dr. Batorf. I have been so grateful to receive her mentorship and kindness since I joined UBCO, and also welcome Jen as the new director of the Institute. It's exciting times. With that, I'll start our presentation. I'm hoping everyone can hear me well. We had a few audio challenges, but fingers crossed I can circumvent all of them. So today we'll be talking about combating tokenism in research. And as Jen mentioned, I am grateful to live, work, play, and be an uninvited guest on the traditional and the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. I wanted to mention one of the 4 food chiefs here on the Syilx traditional territory, and that's the salmon. And every fall, the salmon swim upstream, and they swim together. We can come and see them here around Mission Creek. And in swimming upstream, I think that they highlight what we often feel when we're trying to do inclusive, equitable, and engaged research. When we talk to researchers, when we talk to research users, people with lived experience, often people feel like they're trying to work so hard in a system that's not necessarily supporting them to engage in partnered research. And so I wanted to highlight this piece and also acknowledge my own positionality in the work that I do. So here I've highlighted to you the coin model of privilege and critical allyship from Stephanie Nixon. It's one of my favorite papers It asks us to think of multiple systems of oppression that affect the way we see the world, the way we can move, and the opportunities we have in our society. So from classism to racism to settler colonialism. And so it's important to note, in particular with this work, I work primarily with people with spinal cord injury, but I want to acknowledge that I am of white settler heritage. I am cisgender and heterosexual, but also that I am a person that does not have a spinal cord injury. And I think that's where the power of meaningful engagement, true meaningful engagement, comes in. I bring unearned privilege, and I also bring skills and knowledge to the table, but those pieces are not helpful unless I do that truly in critical allyship and in connection with people with lived experience who often, due to systems of oppression, find themselves on the bottom side of the coin. So I think an important resource to highlight to you all, but also something we'll come back to later in this presentation. So today we're going to talk about three key things. Our main goal is to talk about combating tokenism. So my first goal is to provide an overview of what tokenism is and how that might be opposing to meaningful engagement. And I'm going to situate all of that work in the broader idea of knowledge mobilization and knowledge translation. There are other sort of frameworks you could use to look at it, but that's where my work comes from. I'll also provide an overview of the IKT guiding principles for conducting and disseminating spinal cord injury research in partnership. I mentioned before I primarily work in SEI, and then discuss how maybe you could think about cultivating a practice of meaningful engagement that combats tokenism in your work. I describe myself as a behavioral scientist and an implementation scientist, so that means that I am really interested in how we get research in the real world. So let's start about that idea first. So often we are taught as scientists of how research is supposed to work. We write the grant, we get the money, we do the research, we publish the results, and we repeat, and we repeat, and we repeat, and we repeat. But when our endpoint is publication and not application, we end up creating a system that is sacrificing real-world impact, often for equity-deserving groups, and in science in general. So that's where this idea of knowledge translation or knowledge mobilization, there's over 100 different terms that are broadly talking about this idea of getting research into the real world. Knowledge translation at CIHR in Canada broadly talks about 4 key ideas, and I love this image that comes from my colleague, Dr. Catherine Sibley at the University of Manitoba. It highlights the 4 key pieces of knowledge translation. First, this idea of synthesis. When we're trying to get research out into the real world, we're synthesizing down multiple forms of knowledge that can come from many different knowledge keepers. Then we also think about this idea of exchange, the two-way sharing of knowledge between researchers and research users. We often call this integrated KT, and we'll spend most of our time today talking about integrated KT and how that relates to meaningful engagement. Application, where we think about that often as implementation, putting research into practice. And you'll see that my research program is relatively meta. So we'll talk about exchange, but we'll talk about how we get that in the real world. So we do that application piece. But then also dissemination. That's your classic communication strategies, getting research in the real world is from an awareness perspective. So application being used, dissemination, awareness. If we're thinking about CIHR and health, we're usually thinking about the idea of disseminating, applying, exchanging, synthesizing this information to improve health, the healthcare system, or health service delivery. But that's not to say that knowledge mobilization or knowledge translation don't apply to other disciplines or fields. We see calls for engagement and KT, KM from both SSHRC as well as NSERC. And I'm likely imagining you'll see it from other funders. For today, in the world of knowledge translation, we're going to be spending time on this idea of exchange, that two-way sharing of information, what I often refer to as the idea of integrated knowledge translation or meaningful engagement. And what we see in the research system is we see that research funders, organizations, people with lived experience are continually encouraging or requiring researchers to partner with research users on grants. So researchers, the person whose job it is to carry out research activities, someone like me, research users, individuals or groups that actually use or benefit from that research. This could be a person with lived experience, but it also could be someone within a system. So someone with decision-making power, someone who's providing a service, someone working to support maybe a patient or a person with lived experience. These calls absolutely align from what we hear in the disability communities and from people with spinal cord injury, that when it comes to both healthcare and science, there should be nothing about us without us. And so the partnership that I lead has defined integrated knowledge translation as the meaningful engagement of the right research user at the right time throughout the research process. So we're saying that you have to really think about who that research user is and find out from them when they want to be engaged throughout the research process. For me, many people ask me, what does that look like? Broadly, what it looks like is, as a scientist, me asking people who might use my research or have interest in my skills, how can I help? So I say to organizations or groups that are working in spinal cord injury primarily, what research questions do you have? Here's my broad set of skills. What would be of interest to you? What do you need help with? What would support you? And so my research takes a connection of service in the work that I do. From there, we actually write our funding applications together. We develop the methods together. We conduct the research together. And people always ask me, like, what does that look like? I ask any partner that comes on our grant what roles they want. So often people don't want to do the systematic review, scoping review of screening out papers, but they do want to be there when we're interpreting key findings and we're adjusting and iterating those, and they want to be involved in writing the paper and the dissemination. So we ask a lot about what would be meaningful to you, and sometimes I also have partners with lived experience that do want to get into the nitty-gritty because they're looking to build capacity in that area. From there, we also ask and work with them around adapting and making sure that we analyzing our data and publishing it together. Because they've been involved in all of these processes, they meet authorship requirements. And then this is where I find our partners really shine in a way that I had no concept, is that dissemination. They get our research out and applied sometimes faster than the journal, because for them, the research is already relevant, useful, and usable, and the publication only adds to that. So meaningful engagement does not look like tokenism, and that's the goal of today's talk, is to talk about tokenism in science. So what is tokenism? When is it happening? So it's when a partner is asked to endorse and therefore legitimize research programs over which they have little real influence or control. This is when we recruit a small number of individuals from underrepresented groups to suggest equality or equity in our science. It's including research users in our process without giving them decision-making power. At its simplest term, I often say that it's representation without agency. In spinal cord injury, I've heard a lot of stories of tokenism in science. It's 2 days before the grant is due. They contact a person with lived experience and they say, sign off on this, we need a patient partner. They never hear from that person again, the researcher. They never hear from the researcher again. The researcher never invites them to be part of the research process. They don't have decision-making power, and they never hear what came out of that science. So yes, the funder has required a person with lived experience to be on the grant, and yes, that box has been ticked, but no, there's no meaningful engagement here. I also see this in moments where you get to that point of recruitment. You say, we want to partner with you. Can you do all of our recruitment for us? And we'll let you know how the study goes at the end. The organization that you've asked to do your recruitment is not a partner in that case. And so it's very important to clarify that of if you're just asking for recruitment help, or are you giving them decision-making power? And the key thing with tokenism is you're looking for decision-making power. You want that being shared. So representation with agency. It doesn't mean that I become quiet in the science or that I don't share my knowledge or expertise. It means that we share together and we share decision-making. So if I have concerns about the way the project's going, I'll voice those and those are heard. If a person with lived experience, if a partner has concerns, they voice them, those are heard, and we come to consensus on what we want to do moving forward. In terms of tokenism, I don't think that we want to belabor telling you many stories of tokenism in science today. They're frustrating. There's several examples, and I often say the road to tokenism is paved in good intentions. You don't necessarily will see tokenism if somebody has zero intention of partnering or engaging. In that case, you don't see them engaging at all. Instead, what you see it in is those moments where someone's maybe dipping their toe in, maybe starting to think about engagement and add someone on without really thinking intentionally and authentically of what does it mean to meaningfully partner throughout the process. If you do want to learn more examples of tokenism, what that looks like, I would highlight this concept analysis that gives you 4 dimensions of tokenism, but also describes many examples of tokenism across different groups specific to family and patient engagement. And what they say those 4 dimensions look like are unequal power, so no shared decision-making, limited impact, so that story that I told you of they never got to see what the impact of the science was and their lived experience was never actually brought into it. Ulterior motives, I just want to win the grant, versus I actually want to authentically, meaningfully engage you. And then that it's the opposite of meaningful engagement. So it's the opposite of meaningfully engaging the right research user the right time throughout the research process. And so if we want to combat tokenism, we have to think about how do we do this rising tide lifts all boats? How do we foster meaningful engagement in our research systems so that tokenism is no longer happening, but also all of our research becomes more relevant, more useful, more used, more equitable? So when I first started my career here at UBC Okanagan, I assumed that I would continue being a behavioral scientist who designs interventions with and for people with spinal cord injury by meaningfully engaging. And I was asking the question, how can I help? And we have lots of interventions with organizations like Spinal Cord Injury BC, where I ask, how can I help? And they tell me that we need smoking cessation interventions, or we want to look at peer mentorship, or we want to understand family support. And so we take this meaningful engagement approach and we co-design all our interventions with and for Spinal Cord Injury BC. But the more I asked SEI organizations and people with lived experience about how I could help and what I do, they would ask me questions of why do other researchers not partner? They would tell me stories of tokenism, of what they'd experienced in partnership and how that looked different from what I was doing with them. And so the big question they said to me is, if you're such a great behavioral scientist and you can change everyone's behavior, how about you change the researchers' behaviors? And of course, I feel a little bit sick. But that started getting my ideas going and thinking about what would it actually take to transform the research system to support meaningful engagement in spinal cord injury research and actually combat tokenism. So what would we actually have to do? And use that behavioral science brain that I have, that implementation science brain, but more so partner with people with lived experience and understand what they need to make sure that we're supporting engagement and combating tokenism. So that gets us to the next piece in our presentation today, where I want to have a discussion around our IKT guiding principles and what we actually did to ask how we transform the research system. So what we did is we established a strong North American team of spinal cord injury researchers, spinal cord injury organizations, people with lived experience of SCI, health professionals, and research funders, with most of our team members actually playing multiple roles or multiple hats. The multiple hat type piece helped us keep our partnership, I would say, somewhat manageable and feasible to actually do the work. But also it really provides this deep, rich experience when we're making decisions. Notably, I also want to mention that we're all research users of thinking about guiding principles, thinking about what does it mean to meaningfully engage. As a researcher, I want to use guiding principles, and my partners, research users want that, and funders want that too, as well as institutions. So we all have interest and deep interest in meaningful engagement and the sort of meta science of that. So it's important that we don't just recruit people into our partnerships that the project isn't meaningful to them. So I wanted to also make sure that everyone in our partnership, this idea of meaningful engagement was of interest, was of meaning, was of worthy to them. Our team includes individuals from across North America working in lots of different systems. And what we did as a first step is we created 8 principles. Principles are fundamental norms, rules, or beliefs that represent what is desirable and positive for a person, group, or organization, community. And what it really does, it's the head, but also the heart of your research. It tells you what's right or wrong in your actions. It helps keep you off the road to tokenism that's paid with good intentions, but gives you a way to check in. And so for that reason, it is more basic than policy or objectives, but it governs your policy. It governs your objectives. It governs everything you do. I'm going to tell you what the 8 principles are, and then I'll tell you a little bit of that background piece of how we actually created them and the work we did as a partnership, so you can see that. So in total, the 8 guiding principles, you can check them out on our website. We are working very hard to create an essential hub for changing the way spinal cord injury research is done. So to engage more meaningfully in research that is relevant, useful, or used, that first guiding principle is essential. Partners develop and maintain relationships based on trust, respect, dignity, and transparency. Really, truly seeing the humanity in science, in the people on your team, and that means everyone. It means me as the researcher and my partners as the research user. The trust and the respect are key, and in order to have trust, you need to have boundaries. You need to have accountability. You need to be reliable and also have grace and compassion for each other. These are skills that sometimes are not taught to scientists or not taught in general populations. And so that's something that, while it can sound like one principle, there's a huge amount of work to be done to make sure that we can actually enact this principle. That second principle, partner shared decision-making, this principle is all about combating tokenism, because if you're not sharing in decision-making, you're headed down the road to tokenism. So it is that idea that everyone at the table has decision-making power at that table. We foster open, honest, and responsive communication. Partnerships are based in communication. It takes time, but I think that time makes research more impactful and actually helps to close that gap between research and practice. And then we recognize, value, and share diverse expertise and knowledge. What this says is just because you have a PhD at the table doesn't mean you're the most knowledgeable person at the table, and that knowledge doesn't come with a PhD. It comes from lived experience. It comes from the meaningful engagement maybe you've done in the past. and that we acknowledge that knowledge doesn't just come from science. There are many knowledge keepers in our work. 5, partners are flexible and receptive in tailoring the research approach to match the aims and the context of the project. That means that we shift, we hear people, we may add additional questions, we might do something differently, we might shift entirely, but that means that my partners are listening to me as if I have a PhD student on the project, that, you know what, here's the realistic piece, I need some of these aims in here, can we work with that? And then also their aims in the project. Partners need to meaningfully benefit by participating in the project. And I mentioned trainees here too. So all partners, they're researchers and they're research users. And so we want to make sure that everyone on that team, if you're coming to the table, there is some meaningful benefit to you being at the table, whether that is being reimbursed financially. Ideally, we would like to have it more than that, whether that is you have a genuine interest in this topic, you want to see impact. We want to know what that reason is when you come to the table so that you are not just there to tick a box and say that you're there. And we make sure that that's the case too with our trainees when we ask them to join different projects or work on different pieces. Partners address ethical considerations. This is a big piece, and it's almost its own bucket and research program in itself. There's the ethical considerations of the Research Ethics Board, but there's also the ethical considerations of your partnership, the impacts on equity, the concerns around transparency, being confidential in the work that we do. There's a lot of pieces, both at the project level as well as at the partnership level, that need to be considered when we're considering our work. And then partners respect the practical considerations and financial constraints of everyone. So there are practical and financial considerations that are the case for our trainees, absolutely for our partners. We are thinking about everything from ensuring that we have personal support workers at our meetings in case anyone needs assistance. We think about travel, we think about doing things over Zoom, and we don't always think about everything. So that also means that we are clear and open and responsive with our communication of when we need something, we ask for it, but also when we mess up, we apologize. With also the piece of researchers, I think there are a lot of practical and financial constraints for all of us through the pandemic, but even with myself, I had 2 children over the pandemic, and we had to think about those practical considerations for our team. And so it means that everyone, researcher or research user, has respect and dignity on the team. The guiding principles come out with a preamble. They have the 8 principles and definitions if you want to go and look at them on our website. We designed them with and for people with spinal cord injury, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. But it's important to note that often we see groups beyond our work seeing value in these principles. So how did we actually create these 8 principles? Initially, when we started out on the work, I thought it was important that we acknowledge that we were a key research user of this work. It's spinal cord injury researchers. Spinal cord injury researchers span a diverse group of research disciplines. We have bench researchers who primarily, work with, you're going to clearly know I'm not one, but microscopes and in labs, potentially doing work with animal models, etc. We have clinical researchers that are interested in that bedside piece. And then what we call a backyard researcher, community work, working with community organizations, post-rehab, rehabilitation in community, social participation outcomes. So that means we span diverse positionalities, we span diverse philosophical assumptions, and so it is really challenging to create principles that are seen as rigorous and relevant and useful and valid for this big system. And so what we wanted to do was make sure that we were following a process that was based in creating guidelines. So we used the appraisal of guidelines for research and evaluation to instrument. And we used this to make sure that we could transparently report, but also that we had this very systematic approach so that researchers could see transparently how we did this. Our first step was we did this one-day meeting where we thought about what data sources needed to go into the principles. What sort of information and evidence would we need to be able to create these principles? And one thing was that we would need a long list of principles that are used in partnered research. And so we actually pulled 4 key data sources. We did a review of reviews on partnered research. Femke Hoekstra led that, and I'll highlight that for you in a second. We did a scoping review on principles and strategies used in disability research, specifically in partnership. We did interviews with champions of partnered research, both researchers and research users. And then we did a Delphi consensus study because that 125 principles was a little bit too much for us. So we went out to researchers and research users, people with lived experience, to ask which of these 125 principles should be used to guide spinal cord injury research. From there, we got down to about 35 principles. At that point, we held a 2-day meeting with the entire panel of the big partnership that has many, many hats. And we went through a number of consensus building activities and exercises to get down to 8 principles that had 100% consensus. After that, we sent those out to experts not within our partnership, but that had knowledge either from a researcher or research user perspective about meaningful engagement, and asked for their feedback, and we received very strong reviews of them. So that's how we got to 8 principles. Now you might be thinking, how am I going to replicate this, or can I just use these principles? Where can I learn more about just this long list of principles? I want to highlight this particular resource for you in that review of reviews. So we started with a review of reviews of research partnerships within or beyond health, and we looked at 86 different reviews. We pulled principles, so the head and heart, strategies, observable things people do, outcomes and impacts, what happens in that partnership as a result of some of these things, of different types of research partnerships. So we didn't say that you had to be IKT, you didn't have to be CBPR, you didn't have to be PAR, all these different types of partnership approaches. We said, we'll take, as long as you say you're partnering, we will take that principle and we will take that work. And that's the initial guidance we used for our work. So if you're looking at our principles and saying, I think I would like more than these 8, I want to see more about them, you can go back to that review of reviews, and we have a long list for you to consider about partnership. Also, the guiding principles work is published again, open access, and explains how we did the agreed to pieces, if that's something of interest to you. As well, we're very focused on dissemination. So I said that you're going to see the different pieces of KT in this presentation. So you'll see that we just did a bunch of exchange, but we are working very hard on dissemination. So our iktprinciples.com website, after our publication was out in 2020, we launched this website and the principles in 2021. We have all of our manuscripts, our webinars, postcards, videos, stories of partnership. This is becoming a hub in spinal cord injury research of where you can get training and support. And we've recently won a few grants that'll help us create even more. So keep following us if you're interested in this work. Okay, so I think that's told you broadly how we got to the point of guiding principles, that we're disseminating them, and we're also used exchange and synthesis to get us to that point. But let's talk about application. Let's talk about that key piece of how do we actually make sure these principles are implemented and that they do change the system, but also maybe how you could cultivate meaningful engagement in your own work. So in terms of changing the system, we're asking that same question. We're asking, how can we help? We're asking researchers, spinal cord injury researchers, how can we help? Here's the principles. Why can't you follow them? Tell us what you need. what you need us to work on. We're asking research users that same question, looking at how they're partnering. We're asking funding agencies and looking at funding agencies across North America to see how they are funding partnered research and how they're conceptualizing it. And then we're asking institutions as well, like UBC, how can we help? What do you need for us to support you? Our entire partnership works on all of the different pieces of research in this, and then I've highlighted 3 exceptional trainees below. So we have Ji Yang, or George. He does our work in funding agencies and is leading work to understand how funding agencies look at partnership in spinal cord injury. Alana Schwed in the middle, she's very interested in researchers and how we can support research systems like ICORD to be able to adopt and use the principles in their daily practices. And then Emily Giroux, who's very interested in particular not-for-profit organizations. So all of our trainees work with our partnership and have somewhat sub-partnerships within the larger partnership that guides their questions and their work. Right now, given that I believe I'm talking primarily to researchers who might be interested in how they combat tokenism, I want to highlight in particular Alana's work and our partnership's work around understanding researchers. So we aim to interview researchers from across North America to understand, and across many disciplines of SEI, to understand the major barriers to why they couldn't follow the principles. So now I know what the broad behavior is. As a behavioral scientist, I define the behavior guiding principles, and I want to know why you can't do it. And from that, we design interventions, tools, and resources. We heard a lot of information from researchers about how hard it is to work in that system. If we call back to that idea of the salmon swimming upstream, the water is fierce. They are working and they are motivated to be part of partnered research, but they feel like the water is fierce. And that they both need to scale up, but they also need the water to flow. I don't have time to tell you the full story, but from our semi-structured interview data, we have some quantitative data as well with this, but from our semi-structured interview data, we actually came to consensus among our partnership looking at researchers around some of the key pieces that researchers likely need our partnership or the broader system to address to be able to support meaningful engagement. We see at that individual level that they need that how-to information. At the relational level, they need support to be able to leverage networks and to connect people. They also need training and education, and we're seeing work with Emily with the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consumer Consortium, creating tools and training for research users in the system. So we're already seeing some of our tools going. And then at the institutional level, they need processes that hold us accountable. They need to make sure that our metrics of research impact merit and value the quality of the process of meaningful engagement and not just this publish or perish approach. And they really want us to value resource and incentivize research partnerships because it's hard to work in a system that maybe wasn't initially designed for it. Given that I don't necessarily know what system you're in right now or who your partners are, right now, I want to help you with just some basic how-to information that we can maybe help you navigate some troubled waters if you're experiencing them. So the first question I want you to ask yourself if you're considering meaningful engagement, considering adopting our principles or thinking about a principled approach to partnership, is I want you to think about who are your users? Who are the people that could benefit from the research that you are doing? For some people, the person that benefits might be another researcher in that translational pipeline. For other people, it might be a person with lived experience. For other people, it could be a community organization, a health service organization. Think deeply. You likely have multiple research users and you might need different engagement approaches as well as dissemination approaches for those different groups. I want to highlight that research users are different than your research participants. I see time and time again people telling me that they do meaningfully engaged research because they did interviews on a participant. They didn't design the study with people with lived experience and then co-conducted interviews and analyzed the data. There's a difference. But really consider who those people are and consider asking how you can help. The other piece I'd encourage you to go and do is really think about your own unearned privilege and how you can act in critical allyship. For some people, they do have lived experience of systems of oppression. They do have lived experience of the research that they do. But because of systems of oppression, many researchers do not have lived experience of the work they're trying to do. And so that means that as a researcher, you need to acknowledge your unearned privilege, and you also need to acknowledge how you can work in critical allyship with the different groups you represent and include. I also want to highlight, though, here that if we think intersectionality, like intersectionally about our partnerships, we also have to think about the intersectionality of all the people at the table, the researchers, the research users, the trainees, making sure that we're creating diverse and inclusive environments for everyone on the team. Yes, most of the time, I end up on the top side of the coins, but sometimes I do end up on the bottom, thinking about being a woman in science. And sometimes I need us to think about how we support me as a woman in science in our partnership. But my partners need us to think about how we're supporting many people with lived experience, with diverse world viewpoints. So don't just think about equity when you're thinking about your research users. I think you need to think at a partnership level. From there, once you have people that you're asking questions, they said, how can I help? And they say, we need help with X or Y, and you realize you're the right person potentially to do this partnership. Start to ask yourself, what does it look like to follow each principle? You might want to see if there's any principles you want to add to our list or use a different set of principles. But what does it look like? Because principles are the head and the heart, but strategies are what you're actually doing. So we talk about this idea in our partnership of the head, the heart, the norms, the values, the beliefs as principles. But strategies are something we say that if we turned a movie camera on, if we said action, we should see action in your strategy. And so that is where you take principles and put them into real world, what are you doing at the table? And sometimes that's hard for people to understand. So we've also done some work around principle to strategy and also trying to really understand strategies and synthesize those to support people to be able to select strategies. So we've done 10 semi-structured interviews with SEI research partnership champions, both researchers and research users. And from there, we looked at what principles and what strategies they use, but we also pulled many principles and strategies from our review data. One thing I want to highlight is when we were looking at their experiences, we really saw that for them to be able to move to doing strategies, they needed to promote an attitude shift that actually valued co-production. And that's kind of sometimes hard in a system that doesn't. They had role models, so look for other partnered researchers that can help you with this, that can help you problem solve. They talked a lot about their intrinsic motivation for engagement and avoiding this transactional approach with their partners, and that they had to do a lot of work on fostering their relational skills. So that's one piece. The other piece we were able to do with this work was actually identify strategies and put them into recipe categories. Now, we call it a recipe, but I think I would consider it more a pantry. We give you a long list of principles and strategies you could potentially use, and you and your partnership should have shared decision-making of what you want to do and how you want to approach it. But I've highlighted a resource here that hopefully will help you, available via our website. So we do work around giving example principles and then showing you the recipe categories that we've seen in the data, either our interview data, but also we see in our review data that may be linked to these different principles. But there with the little QR code in the corner, I've also given you a PDF document that our partnership created that gives you this huge long list of strategies that you could consider. I cannot tell you whether or not those strategies will work for you. The quality of the literature and partnership, it's just not well reported enough to tell you about how well a strategy works. All I can tell you is those are strategies we've seen being used in the literature, and then I think you need to use your own critical judgment to see if those ones are what you think would work for you. Okay, so we've been on a journey. We've talked about what tokenism is and what meaningful engagement is. I've told you about how we tried to combat tokenism and foster meaningful engagement by developing our guiding principles, and then showed you some of the resources and tools and ways we're thinking that could help individuals cultivate a practice of meaningful engagement. At the end of the day, I think what I'm really talking to you is about integrity in research and integrity in research partnerships. Brene Brown's quote on integrity is one of my favorites, that this work is not easy. So it means you're going to have to choose courage over comfort. It might not be your status quo. It means that you'll have to choose what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy. It means you'll need to slow down and actually hear people potentially, to connect with them, to stop and say, is this the right thing to be doing right now? But I would argue that does make things more fun and easy long-term, and maybe even get your research out faster long-term. And it also means that we're choosing to practice our values or our principles rather than simply professing that we care about meaningful engagement. Our partnership likes to say that we are a rising tide lifts all boats, and our goal is to rise the tide on research partnership and SEI. And that by doing that, we hope that we can close the gap between research and practice and really create a more equitable and inclusive research system for all of us. There are so many people that help me do all of this work. This is not just me at all. This is a huge number of people's time and energy and effort and gracious funding from many organizations. If you would like to connect with me or our partnership, that's our information, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Heather. That was absolutely wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed that. If you have questions to the audience, please place them in the chat and I'll go about reading them. And we have a little under 10 minutes. So Heather, we do have some questions in the chat. You might be able to see them yourself, but I'll go about reading the first one. I have a ton, so I'm going to make my way up at some point to the other building and have a great cup of coffee with you and a chat. But for now, we'll go to the chat that's filling up quite quickly. So the first question was, will you be doing any training, so communication strategies for researchers on how to engage with users?
Yeah, 100%. We were just in a meeting last week talking about how we co-design a full training for researchers on the principles and really putting all those resources together for them. We also have been working on a toolkit. So if they don't want to engage in a training, it sort of puts all of those resources in one place. And I think it's maybe one of our most challenging pieces yet, because it requires us to put a lot of resources together. But yes, we're doing it. So watch this space for sure.
Okay. The same question applies with or to persons with lived experiences. Are there going to be any training sessions or opportunities for individuals to engage in that manner?
Yeah, so that's where our partners are way more incredible and efficient than I am. And so the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium built a huge team of people with lived experiences and researchers from across North America, including many bench scientists, which continually is our biggest challenge of how to help bench scientists too, and bring people into more bench research. And they've created a training, and I can put it in the chat, for people with spinal cord injury or anyone that wants to be a research user to essentially skill you up. And I think many people already have amazing skills, but if you are hoping to build your confidence or your motivation to do that, they've created that. And Emily Giroux, who I mentioned, currently is evaluating the outcomes of that course. So we didn't design the course. The guiding principles are within them and embedded. North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium did that piece because the work was so meaningful to them. And then we'll tell you, we'll help them evaluate and iterate it. Yeah.
That's great. And building on the persons with lived experience and the research users. And I don't know if you've ever encountered this, but could you speak to what happens if the ultimate goals of the end users potentially don't align? So let's say persons with lived experiences and policymakers and government, like how do you navigate that type of dynamic?
Yep, absolutely. So I think it starts with that principle of like all of us have to have meaningful benefit. So you are coming in agreeing to that, and that's why it's so valuable to have partnership agreements, but discussions about principles with the whole group before you start. It's not too late if you're not, but principles are valuable because they're kind of like a prenup in a way. And they help you think about like, well, we all agreed to this piece. And so then it's coming back and saying, what does everyone really need to be able to feel like they meaningfully benefited from this project? What can people shift? What flexibility do we have? And sometimes we've had the case where we need to like divide the project in two. So we need something different for policymakers and we're meaningfully engaging them, and we need something different for people with lived experience and we're meaningfully engaging them. For example, when we first started looking at research users, we were asking like broadly from research users, and then we were like, nope, this is not going to work. We need to actually think about what does a not-for-profit organization need? What does a clinician need? And so we've had to prioritize that way. And then worst case scenario is nobody wants to be in a partnership they shouldn't be in. And so sometimes you have to end your partnership, and that is the best thing you can do for everyone. I haven't seen a lot of that, but sometimes people say, you know what, this is no longer meaningful for me, and it's time for me to go. I think where it gets really challenging is when people are like, no, you have to stay because we said in the grant. That's when resentment builds. So clear communication, be willing to shift.
Yeah, we love you. Don't leave us. You're so valuable.
Yeah.
But the pulls of so many different aspects of researchers and life really does come up.
And we see that, right? We've
That
seen
roller coaster.
people's lives, the researchers, the research users, all kind of shifting in and out, where we'll have someone that's like our most engaged person on this piece of the project, but if you ask them about this over here, they're like, you know what, I'm okay. I just need you to inform me about what you found. So that paper on tokenism was actually, it's really interesting. There's a piece in there that says, not all, quote, tokenism is bad. What matters is you give people decision-making power on the level of engagement they have. You get really clear with them. And sometimes someone will say to you, the level of engagement I want is I want you to go and answer my question and come back to me. That's the amount I want. I have zero time, interest, energy, or I want you to engage with this other person,
Right.
not me.
That's
so
great.
it's okay if someone doesn't sit beside you the whole way through, as long as you both know and you've asked that question.
That's great. Now, with respect to that, the next question, and I think this will be the last one that we have time for today, is about compensation. So as a user, they don't want the requirement to compensate users stall kind of the engagement or the process. How do you go about navigating that situation?
That is our consistently difficult question, and something that we have one of our partner organizations is specifically looking at that and doing a deep dive into compensation. And we're also pulling data on that when we're looking at funding organizations of what they'll let us compensate and how they do that. In our own partnership, we have a prenup, we have our partnership agreement that has agreed on standards of compensation for everyone on the team. So it's clear what researchers are doing and what we get, that if you are paid for your role to be here, we don't compensate you beyond that, other than like incurred costs. If you're not being paid to be here and you're losing either working funds, or you are like not being paid somewhere else and need funding, we will always offer, and this is the amount we offer with additional supports, like whether someone needs childcare or accessible transportation, that we offer, and you are absolutely within your right to decline it. So we also say you can decline it. So within spinal cord injury, there are a lot of challenges around disability payments, and we don't want to create any challenges around that. So we do the most autonomous approach we can and the most flexible approach we can. That said, the amounts, we've looked at different amounts and had to like try and figure out what seems reasonable and feasible for our grant. But I think there'll be better data on amounts of compensation and like a terrible question, but what is lived experience worth? And that is what some of our organizations are asking, to make sure that people aren't unduly burdened by the work and they're valued for their work. So that's a challenge to navigate, but I think open conversations about it. And I think when we did our partnership agreement, that one took 30 to 40 minutes for all of us to really, and then many iterations, but one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah, and the transparency within that and the conversations, I think can really assist and build meaningful parts to the relationship. So we're running out of time here. I just want to say, when I first heard you ask, how can I help? I think I'm just going to start calling you UBC Okanagan's version of New Amsterdam's Max Goodwin, because I think that was the second time I heard it as I was watching that television series. So there you have it. We've elevated you to a TV level, if you will.
Oh, very cool. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Heather. This has been a wonderful, wonderful session for all of us today. In addition to thanking you, I would like to thank our audience, our participants today, and let them know that the recording for this will be available online. We've had a request for the slides, but the whole presentation will also be available since we've recorded it. So thank you very much, Heather. Thank you, everyone else, and enjoy the rest of your day, wherever that may be. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.